Hello, everyone. I, of course, am Christine Gritman, and this is Let's Talk About Brand. I do this show every single Friday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Normally, it is normally a live stream show, and I am coming at you now on these various channels at noon on Friday, but secret time. This one's pre-recorded. This was pre-recorded for two reasons. Number one, I am on vacation. Whew. And number two, our guest today is from Australia. And we didn't want her to have to get up at 3 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday to join us here today. So we have pre-recorded, but I'm doing it as though live. Nothing here is edited. So, just pretend it's a live show. And I still want to see your comments because I do go back and read them and answer them. So please keep the comments coming. Just pretend we're live and make sure to join us next Friday at noon also when we will be live once again. I want to give a shout out to a couple of things that support this show and keep it going. One of them is my Tuesday Twitter chat about brand. That I like keeping things easy, so that is at 12 noon Eastern Time on Tuesdays on Twitter, of course, using the hashtag #chat-about-brand. Each week's chat is on the same topic as that Friday's guest interview is going to be on. So it gets us warmed up to sort of think about the topic. So you can just check back and see this past Tuesday's fantastic discussion on branding a community. Speaking of community, that's the other thing I need to give a shout out to. I have a wonderful, wonderful group of Patreon supporters. I would love to have you among them. The thing about my Patreon is it's not just, hey, buy Christine a cup of coffee to keep the show going. What it really is it's a way for me to take each week's branding lessons and help you apply them directly to your building your own personal brand. So there really is an educational component to that community that I'm putting forth on Patreon. And every week I try to see if I can name everyone. I should have a post-it note or something, but let's see. They're all in the end credits, but let's see. I've got Emma Pirchu. I've got Bonnie Wilson. I've got Suzanne, is your name Brown? Okay, Susie. Suzanne Brown. I've got Maiko Sakai. I've got Natalie Gregg. Fabulous people, wonderful supporters. And I've got Amanda Hahn Peters. You see, I always miss one. All right, so they are fantastic supporters. I love them all. And really, they're making great strides in investing in their own personal brands, and we welcome you to do the same. Okay, on to this week's show. This week's show is all about branding a community. We had a lot of discussion this week on the chat about what a community really means and how you sort of define that in your own mind when it comes to online communities, offline communities, how the two can be mutually beneficial, all that jazz. And we talked about that because today's special expert guest is Anna McAfee. So now she did a fantastic thing. She has been involved in community for a while, but a few years ago, she started an incredible online, offline connection community called LinkedIn Local. So we are going to talk about that and about her feelings and thoughts on community in general. Without any further ado, let's bring on Anna. Hello, Anna. How are you today?
I'm really well, Christine. It's great to be here and chatting with you.
Yeah, and you're coming at us
live. We're still having a great, it's still great to be here.
And we're still live, you and me, right? You are coming at us live from the future. It is Thursday morning where you are.
It is Thursday morning at the time of recording, yes. So, yes, I can't provide much insight from the future, unfortunately, but here I am.
All right, so as I said in the intro, one thing that you are known for is co-founding LinkedIn Local, but let's back up a little bit. I would like to hear kind of who you are beyond and outside of that and how you came to co-found LinkedIn Local.
So my career background began actually in the recruitment industry, which is why I fell so in love with LinkedIn and why I knew a little bit about LinkedIn. And so I was basically a trainer, as well as I dealt with a lot of back office side of a startup recruitment agency. And at the time I was in the UK and Scotland. And suddenly this thing called LinkedIn came along. And of course, we went from CRM systems to live live data on LinkedIn. So I had to get fairly cluey because I was the CRM trainer, so I became the LinkedIn trainer internally, and so that's how I guess found LinkedIn. But I am, of course, not Scottish. I'm from Australia, and then around about 10 years ago, I moved back to Australia. So, and I have been educating on LinkedIn ever since. So, started very much doing it for recruitment agencies, and then have been doing it for brands and individuals since then. So that's where my love of LinkedIn came from. And so that's really where the whole idea, I guess the whole concept of me feeling around and looking for things going on, and why I first went to LinkedIn. But it was back in 2017. I found myself, I had two very young children. They were sort of 1 and 3 at the time. And I was, I guess, craving some adult conversation. And I started to go to networking events, and I was setting up my business. And I was not necessarily enjoying those networking events as such, or I was finding it just very tricky to get to. And so my default was to go to LinkedIn and look for people. And I discovered all these amazing business people in the local area online that I could connect with through LinkedIn, but I wasn't meeting them at events. So through a few conversations, we decided to maybe we should get together. So I put up a post, said I'm going to host a LinkedIn local event here in Coffs Harbour in Australia. Who would like to come, please comment below, and I'll put together a date and a time and a venue, and we'll all get together. And it was just meant to be as simple as that. But of course, the post was picked up by Alexander Galvez in London, Eric Eklund in Brussels, and Swish Goswami, who was in Toronto at the time, but just about to go to New York. And so, yeah, it suddenly became a global thing. We had 4 people in 4 cities, and it very quickly escalated.
Wow. So just to back up a little bit, you mentioned that you were going to networking events, and I mean, the right people weren't there. It just wasn't a satisfying experience. What was missing for you in those events, and what did you feel like you could do better?
Look, I felt that there was a couple of things missing. One was the events were very much designed around pitching. So here, come and pitch your wares, and I wasn't necessarily in that space yet. I find that I feel like I'm an introvert, and I feel like there are a lot of people that perhaps want to go to events, but they don't want to have that round table where you stand up and say, well, this is what I do for a living. Because a lot of us are still figuring that out. Like, a lot of us don't want to stand up in front of a room of people and say, oh, well, this is me, and this is what I'm about, and this is what I'm selling, because a lot of us haven't figured that out. And so I wanted something that I didn't feel so alienated by. And I also think as well, there's something that I've learned about events and community building over the last few years is first impressions really matter when it comes to events. And so I feel, and I this is something I'd always do, have always done at my own events, and I've always encouraged when I used to mentor a lot of LinkedIn local hosts, was make sure that first welcoming part of, and that can be when somebody first walks in the door. It can be when you're first welcoming people, if it's a speaking event, is to really set the tone and the vibe for where you're at, because that first initial impression makes a huge difference to how events and gatherings go. So that would
What
just
are
be a
some
couple of
ways
things.
that event hosts can make that good first impression and can make people comfortable right away at a networking event?
Look, my gatherings are very small, so we tend to do it quite informally, but one thing that I have seen done at a LinkedIn local event, which I just loved, which was actually in Sydney, and shout out to Jane Jackson and Gillian Bullock, who put this event together, was they had someone at the door that was responsible, and it's for ticking off names, but someone else that was there to greet the person, talk to them. And then we had further people in the room, and I was one of them, that we could actually filter back to. So as more people arrived, so there was never a point where anybody got to an event and went, oh, this is really uncomfortable. Like, I don't know anyone here. I don't know who to talk to. There was always people actually responsible for that process and that flow through as people arrived. And that made such a difference, because I don't think anybody walked into that event and went, what am I meant to do? Like, do I just go to the drinks table, or go to the bar and work something out? So just having that the last thing you ever want at an event is somebody in the corner not knowing anyone and not having, you know, and feeling like they can't talk to anyone. So you really need that welcoming vibe.
Absolutely. And that happens to everyone at some point. I mean, I'm a pretty active networker and I've got this outgoing personality, but it happens to me. I've walked into an event and been sort of seized by this social anxiety, and I'm like, I know how to do this. I just can't remember how to do this. And, it really can help so much just having that welcome, knowing you're in the right place, and just feeling like you're part of it immediately. It's not something that's happening to you. You're part of the experience. Now you
Absolutely.
mentioned now you mentioned that when you set up your own event, you posted on LinkedIn and you said, I'm having a LinkedIn local event. Now, as the title of your book says, the hashtag that changed the world, or how a hashtag changed the world, why did you go with hashtag LinkedIn local? And did you hashtag it that first time, or did you become
So
one?
that first one I did, just at the very end of the post, I put, like I had written the post, and at the very end I had thought, oh, I might put a hashtag on this. And this was before hashtags were even a thing on LinkedIn. And it had just, the thought in my head had been, well, there was someone I know, Mark Williams, who's a LinkedIn trainer who runs a great podcast, had written an article a few weeks previously that said, how can we get millennials to engage more on LinkedIn? And bear in mind, this is over 4 years ago. And one of my suggestions in the comments on that, I think, had been to, one of the things I'd said was, why don't we use hashtags more? Because they're very, very big on other platforms, but they're really not on LinkedIn. So because of, I think I had that thought in my head. So as I was writing the post, I thought, I'm just going to might put a hashtag on this, because I thought maybe somebody else would like to do this. I mean, maybe it's not just me. And so I did put the hashtag LinkedIn local on it. And it was an afterthought. It wasn't intentional. But I have to say that afterthought might have been the single biggest career decision I ever made.
Wow, that is a bold statement.
Yeah. Well, it completely changed my life. And because I went from being a LinkedIn trainer to a community builder, and I've got to say, everything about LinkedIn local I adored. And as you know, Christine, I mean, it was an entirely voluntary community, and I found myself building this community for nothing over a job that I was getting paid to do, because I just loved it so much. And so, and of course, since then I've, obviously written a book, and I do a lot of speaking around community building as well. And so it did really change my whole idea of what community is, what belonging is, building global communities, because at the peak before LinkedIn stepped in, was, and by the way, it still exists. We should probably clarify that. When LinkedIn stepped in, they released some terms which really clarified how we could use their brand, and that was, a very great move for a lot of our hosts. But it meant that we didn't need to run the community anymore. So, but the community at that point was in 92 countries. And I know I counted it at the 2-year mark, we were at 96 countries. So it was huge in a very small space of time. So
my goodness.
Career decision was, yes, it took over my life, but it really, it gave me the biggest learning experience imaginable from a career perspective.
Now, I understand that initial hashtag was almost kind of a throwaway talk, hashtag LinkedIn local, because you're bringing the LinkedIn experience local. Did people at that first event, or as you mentioned, some people got hold of it and, got wind of it, and then it kind of blew up from there. Did people think that it was affiliated with LinkedIn? And did LinkedIn kind of have words with you? Were you worried that they might? What were your thoughts on using the LinkedIn brand in that?
Look, I think, we didn't head out with the intention of it being a huge thing. So it was very much 4 people, 4 cities, let's just run a few events. And it was more that the events were going so well that we just kept running them. I mean, I still host events where I am in Australia. So it definitely still, it has a long-term trajectory. But I don't think we gave too much thought. I think most people that attended events knew they were independent. They knew they were just organized by LinkedIn users. And that is what actually the LinkedIn local terms now make very clear is, yes, it's open available to any LinkedIn user. Just make it clear it's not affiliated. So there was in some cities a bit of confusion around particularly the larger events as they got bigger. I know there was an event actually held in conjunction with a San Francisco office, one of LinkedIn's offices there. And I know
Oh,
in
wow.
Germany, there's been a couple that have actually worked collaboratively with a local LinkedIn office. But I guess, yes, it was a very gray area.
Mhm.
And it was something that we were always very mindful of. We, in the very early days, tried to contact LinkedIn. So we never actually heard from any LinkedIn employees from head office, at least, until
That's so weird on their part.
until a year in. And at that point, we were in about 50 countries and sort of a few hundred cities. And that's not for lack of trying. We really
Yeah.
had tried. It was getting the right person, I think. I had such enormously positive feedback from so many LinkedIn employees, but it was working out which team was
Mhm.
actually high enough and senior enough and had the decision-making power to really look at this and say, and to be honest, our intention was always good. That was why we
Yeah.
never charged for it. We
Mhm.
thought if LinkedIn see this as a money-making thing, it's not going to work in their mind. But if we do this and build it on the basis that we can work in conjunction with their teams, and really build this community, we really saw that as, the biggest potential. And given the social impact that it was having in terms of, and this is pre-pandemic, bear in mind,
Yeah.
the stories of people just kind of finding their tribe offline and really connecting with LinkedIn who weren't previously creating content on LinkedIn. They were going to events, they were learning it. Um, Creating these communities really had an enormous, I think, mental health impact, but also social impact. And for example, Baltimore are partnered with Living Classrooms. I know just
Oh, wow.
prior to the pandemic, they had raised $30,000 for Living Classrooms. So there was an enormous social impact side to what we were doing. And so I would have loved to have seen us, in a parallel universe, partner with. There's actually a social impact arm for LinkedIn called
Mhm.
LinkedIn Food. I could really have seen that being part of something that their offices do, with that whole social impact side. So
That would have
um,
been a fantastic partnership.
yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of what we were actually starting to see was a lot of campuses,
Mhm.
universities and colleges saying, could we run one on campus? And, there
That's a
was
great idea.
a number of really go-getting, students or just graduated students who were organizing these events. And what an amazing collaboration I
Yeah.
think that LinkedIn could have got involved in, but not up to me.
Nope.
And
You tried, you tried.
I tried. But having said that, I think there's food for thought there in the
Mhm.
future for not just LinkedIn, but other brands in
Well,
terms of how can you enrich your brand experience offline? We really learned that. I definitely learned that and do a bit of consulting on that, in terms of setting up chapter-based communities and and how they can really help, you know, new users come in or existing users come in, connect with the brand, become more active. And because there's some amazing stories of people who didn't create. I mean, Shay Rowbottom is actually a really good example of this, because I know she was dragged to an event in Milwaukee, hadn't even thought about LinkedIn. And
mhm.
I met her at this Sydney event that I mentioned, and she said to me, I didn't use LinkedIn until somebody dragged me to this LinkedIn local event in Milwaukee. And I went, this is really cool. I might start creating content on LinkedIn. And as we all know, Shay is, was one of the biggest followings on the platform.
It would have been such a I mean, I'm just staggered by what a miss it was on the part of LinkedIn to not bring you in to do this. But regardless, as you mentioned, it really you built such a community. There were guidelines, in terms of it not being something that the organizers profited from. The social good component wasn't a rule, but it's something a lot of people ran with. And I know from personal experience, it's really funny. I had my own interview and training with your LinkedIn local team right before the LinkedIn announcement. So I had my training with your team, your volunteer team, and then we put our event on the calendar. By the time the event rolled around, it was no longer that was after LinkedIn kind of stepped in and put their own terms out. But we still followed and are following again. We're going to do an event in November now that we can again. We're still kind of following the original guidelines that you set out, and I'd like you to talk about that a bit because, of course, it started as you just throwing an event together. It blew up to all these different countries all over the world. And the really fascinating thing is that this wasn't people saying, oh, that person did an event locally, I'll do an event locally, and just calling it their own thing. They united under this hashtag LinkedIn Local umbrella. And under that LinkedIn, the first LinkedIn Local I attended was in New York City, and I made some great connections that I am close to this day, which was fantastic. And in fact, I've become close to people who I didn't even know were there, but were. And I immediately was like, I need to get involved in this. And they said, oh, well, you have to contact somebody and, have this whole vetting process. So I'd like to talk about how that grew and how you figured out sort of what you wanted a LinkedIn Local event to really be. Because there are guidelines, there were interviews, you made it very clear.
Yeah,
How did you put
yeah.
that
I mean,
together?
I don't think we necessarily interviewed, but we certainly, I'd say mentored. But because there was never the only barrier to entry was, as a host, was you needed to turn up to a free Zoom call. And, once you'd attended that call and just understood the values and the story and the history and things like not making it very clear that it wasn't affiliated with LinkedIn, you were in. There was never a point of, no, you're not good enough kind of thing. It was very much open and all available to anyone who wanted to do it. I think the biggest thing that we did with that was collaboration. And we worked out very quickly that cities needed to be collaborative. And so that didn't mean that you couldn't start a group if there was already one in your city, but you should really we were very encouraging and created the means for hosts to get to know others in their area. And so great example for that would be Toronto, who had, I think, about 6 different locations around the city that ran events. And they worked really well together on dates and shared speakers and often went to each other's events. And that was really, really helpful. So collaboration was the big one. But how we kind of came up with it was, I guess, a bit of trial and error. I mean, we really did move fast and break things, as the old saying goes, because we had to. But very early on, Eric, Alexandra, Swish, and I had really established some core values around what we wanted the community to run by. So I mentioned collaboration, authenticity, diversity. We wanted diversity was a really big one for us. We didn't want people setting up exclusive invite-only events. They should be open and available to all users and free if possible. And although I know that isn't the case in a lot of cities where it's even possible to run free events, but also pitch free was the really big one, because these are about community events, and we were trying to be not just every other networking event. It was about just come as you are. And there was a guy in Texas that I know who put it so well to me. He said he went to his first event in his work shirt with his logo, with his name embroidered on it. And he felt a bit out of place. And he said the next one he went as himself, and he just loved that. And we wanted people to create those spaces where you could just be yourself. You could come as you are. And yes, there were panels around creating content on LinkedIn or personal branding on LinkedIn, but it was not about, this is our advice and here are the services we offer. We're here to all help each other. We're here to get to know each other. We're here to build a community that you can continually come back to and tap into and get support through, and not just around people selling programs or selling books or anything else. It was really about creating those spaces and valuing probably the person more than the speakers and the panels.
Absolutely. I know that for my own group, LinkedIn Local, it was LinkedIn Local Westchester, now it's LinkedIn Local Hudson Valley. We charged a small fee because otherwise people don't show up.
Yeah.
But it did go to charity, and we made sure that we got our venue sponsored. So basically the venue would give us the venue. They were the sponsor. We got the food sponsored by small local businesses. And so those were the only people who were allowed to pitch. Right before we started with networking, open networking, and just chit chatting and all of that. And it was a very friendly environment. And then right before we did the panel, we'd allow the venue sponsor and the food sponsor to say something, and also the representative of that month's charity. We did a few different charities because my co-host and I are involved in a lot of local nonprofits personally, and we actually discovered some new ones while doing this. And so we had the person from the organization that was benefiting from the evening do that. And in fact, one of our charities actually ran a 50-50 raffle during the event, which they hadn't really cleared with us first. We're like, we don't really like asking people for money at the event, but it did work out very nicely. And that also gave us some social content too, because we're able to be like, hey, look who won, and look at this event they're doing. And our panels, the diversity thing definitely stuck with us. I made sure that I put together our panels, and I made sure that we had not only equity of gender, but we could not have 4 white people up there. I'm like, that is not going to happen. So so that was really a great kind of set of guidelines to go by, because we knew that no one was going to like come spank us and kick us out of LinkedIn Local if we didn't do all those things. But we just really liked those community guidelines. We thought that you guys put together a good thing. Now, sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, and there was something around, we knew what worked, and we didn't intentionally set up the community, and people could just go off and run a LinkedIn Local without us. I mean, we didn't know the name, but the thing was, people came to us because they said, I want to replicate what everyone else has done that seems to be working. How do I do that? And so that was how, ultimately, to answer your previous questions, we came up with the guidelines as, well, we know what's worked in 50 cities so far. Let's create guidelines around it, so that people can replicate it. And that's what the guidelines were ultimately for, was so people could replicate the success.
Yeah. So, and if they're going to be running an event under that same name, you might as well make sure that people know what they're going to get. I know people who've been to LinkedIn Local events in numerous cities, and they felt welcome at them. So very well branded community there. So tell us, what is next? I know that you stopped being directly involved with the LinkedIn Local movement. You created another thing called Local X. What's next for you, or what's current for you in terms of your involvement with community building? Because I know it's still a major focus of yours.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I still do a lot of LinkedIn training, but that's very much on the community side of things. So as I call it, building your virtual village on LinkedIn. So I still do a lot of LinkedIn training. I do all the community consulting. So either consulting to primarily individuals who are looking to establish their own communities, or alternatively brands who are looking to create, I guess, to replicate a lot of what happened with LinkedIn Local, which was chapter-based communities, creating guidelines around that, creating mentoring, options, and all of that type of thing that I was able to cut my teeth on with LinkedIn Local. And we've just wrapped up, actually, but hosting a podcast actually on mental health in the workplace, which has been a new challenge for me, and really fun to dive into something I'm really passionate about, which is mental health. It will be of no surprise to you that I suffered from burnout when I was running LinkedIn Local, and very much towards the end, because I was just so burnt out after this huge global community. And running it, and so to do a mental health, I've just been presenting it and hosting it, which has been really, really fun. So I haven't had to do any editing or anything, but that's literally just the last episode of that's dropped this week, and so that's been super cool to be involved with as well.
Nice. I really admire not only how you built that community from scratch and how you nurtured it throughout, but also the fact that you knew and respected when it was time to be, because when LinkedIn issued their own guidelines, you didn't get, weird about it. You've done great things with it, and you've said, you know what, this is my time to let this go and to go on and do other things. And your newsletter is fantastic. It's all about community, so people should certainly check that out. To that end, Anna, tell people where they can and should find you.
Look, I LinkedIn is the probably first and foremost is to find me on LinkedIn. I am also on Instagram and Twitter, just as my name, Anna McAfee. My newsletter, which is localx.substack.com, and I should mention I'm doing a love letter to my community series, which is stories from around the world, people who've been impacted by a community in some way. That's what I'm finding the time for and kicking off and ramping up. As well as peppered in with sort of community building based stuff in that newsletter. So they would be the sort of 3 or 4 places that are best to find me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Anna. Especially, since we had to work out a time for it and everything. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, and thank you very, very much for encouraging community online, because that's something we certainly need more of, especially nowadays.
Thank you so much, Christine. This has been such a great conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Again, today's show was not live, but please, I hope you have been commenting along in the comments, because I do go back and read those things. And let us know if you joined us during the usual Friday noon time slot, or if you are joining us on the replay. Also, let me know what platform you're joining us on. This show goes live on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, of course, and YouTube. So let us know where you're joining us from. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a Twitter chat every single Tuesday at 12 noon Eastern time. So check us out for next week's topic, which is branding with sound. And that is going to be bolstered by next Friday's live show. It will be live again, and we are going to have sound editor Jessica Gramuglia on the show. And she's going to talk to us about how she has helped lots of brands use sound in their branding to enhance their brand. So I hope we'll see you there. Thanks. Bye-bye.